My name's Michael Roth, and today I am in the clubhouse here at Kiepersol, and we're going to be talking about Jimmy's Bourbon. I've got two different bottles here. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about these later on, but I just wanted to point out a couple of interesting facts about bourbon. Now, some of you may not know what bourbon is, so let's classify and understand and give a little bit of education on what bourbon is. All bourbons are whiskey, but not all whiskeys are bourbon. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to break that down. So, in May of 1964, the United States Congress, I've got a little sheet here, I'm going to link it below, but basically in 1964, the United States Congress declared that bourbon is uniquely an American beverage. Now, some of you have heard that bourbon only comes from Bourbon, Kentucky. Now, they have some of the richest history when it is concerning bourbon. However, the United States Congress declared that it has to be made in the United States. So really, you can get bourbon anywhere distilled in the United States. Now, when it comes to our mash, it's very important to understand that it has to be at least 51% corn. We're going to have rye, and then we're going to also have barley as well. Now, you can substitute, instead of rye, you could have wheat. However, with Jimmy's Bourbon, we're going to be mostly talking about corn, rye, and barley. Now, the third classification of what bourbon is, if you're going to make bourbon, you have to follow all of these rules and steps. The third is that you have to have a newly charred oak barrel every time you make a batch of bourbon. If you try to use a previously used bourbon, by law, you are making whiskey. You can no longer call it bourbon. When you get that newly charred barrel, you're going to get a lot of good flavors out of it, and it's going to go ahead and age in there. Now, during the distillation process, it is important to understand your alcohol level, percentage, and proof. So in the case of distilling bourbon, your bourbon cannot be distilled higher than 160 proof. So to kind of give you some contrast, here at Kiepersol, we take our excess grapes and make our vodka. And when we're making our vodka, we're getting around 190 proof. In other words, about 95% pure ethanol, just pure alcohol, and it shouldn't have any distinct odor, taste, or flavor. However, bourbons, if you ever tried bourbons or whiskey, you're going to notice that you're going to have a lot of flavors in it. Well, it's very important that during the distillation process, we don't get above that 160 proof. It could be less than that, but it can't be no more than 160 proof. Once we're done distilling down that bourbon mash, we're going to add it to the newly charred oak barrel, and from there, it can be no more than 125 proof going into the barrel. So if we have to cut it, we'll add water. Water is the only thing we can add to the bourbon itself to cut it, to bring it down to that alcohol proof. Defining of what a bottle of bourbon is, it has to be at least 80 proof or higher. Now, Jimmy's Bourbon ends up 90 proof for our regular Jimmy's Bourbon that you can find on the store shelves throughout the state of Texas. So that means that we're going to take those barrels that are ranging, again, from 106 to 140 proof, and then we're going to either blend those together, and then we're going to add a little bit of water. We're going to cut it with some water. We're going to get that down to 90 proof before we bottle it. What that is doing is allowing the distiller to find out what the bourbon's best flavors and characteristics are, so that way when we add the water, what it does is it opens that up. It expresses it. The water really expands the palate, what we get to experience on our mouth and on our taste, as well as the flavors that we get out of the bourbon. Now, most of our customers have enjoyed our Jimmy's 90 proof for quite a few years now, which has been very exciting. This is our cask strength Jimmy's Bourbon, and I'll talk about what that means in just a second. So let's define a couple of things that you'll typically see on a bottle of bourbon on the store shelf. So here we have Jimmy's Bourbon, and it says straight bourbon whiskey. Now, in order to have a bottle of straight bourbon whiskey, it has to have aged in a newly charred oak barrel for at least 2 years. We're able to call it straight because we actually aged for 4 years, which is 2 years beyond the minimum in order to call it straight whiskey. We talked about how Jimmy's Bourbon is typically aged for 4 years. So what that means is anytime you see a year on the bottle, on the label of a bottle of bourbon, that just means that the youngest bourbon that was mixed together to make this bottle of bourbon was aged for at least 4 years. We could have a 7 or 10 year aged bourbon. We can blend it together And as long as the youngest age is 4 years, we can still maintain a 4-year age. We talked about, we got our 90 proof. Now we have a cask strength, or also known as barrel proof. Cask strength, in other words, it's literally the same a level of proof of alcohol that came out of that barrel, and then we bottled it. It has no water added to it, so it's literally the full characteristics of that bourbon aging in that oak barrel. In this case, our first release of the cask strength, which is super exciting, is 119.6 proof. And what's really neat about getting a cask strength is you're going to have a lot of unique characteristics coming out of that one single barrel. And in a way, you get to kind of become the distiller. So obviously our distiller is going to make the actual bourbon. It's going to age for a little while. Typically before it gets bottled, like I said, we're going to add and cut it with water. And that is going to add a lot of different flavors. Well, some of you really like a strong bourbon, and that's great. So you can enjoy cask strength. Now, there's no right or wrong way specifically to enjoy bourbon. You get to decide that for yourselves. And that's what's great about buying cask strength, is that because this is basically the same product that was literally in the barrel, we're going to be able to put that into our glass, okay? And then you can cut it with water yourself. You can get a little water dropper, or you can literally just pour a little bit of water in and allow yourself to open up a lot of those flavors that you can't get until you add that water. Because a lot of times, if you were to put this into a glass, you're going to notice a lot of alcohol. Now, a little tip, when you are sniffing bourbon or any spirit, really, it's important that you not only put the glass up to your nose, but you want to keep your mouth open. And when you breathe in to smell, you're smelling with your nose and your mouth at the same time. So and that way you get the full experience without that alcohol burn. Because if you just try to breathe in with just your nose, you're going to end up with a lot of alcohol burn in your nose. With cask strength, really exciting. You're going to have an opportunity to really tone this down if you want to, or drink it straight up if that is something, or neat as they call it, if that's what you prefer. But you get to control that. And maybe you're feeling a little bit different from day to day. You know, maybe one day you want to drink it straight, and other days you just want to add a few ice cubes and let that kind of, sip on that over time as it evolves in your glass, which is a fun thing to do. We're a winery and we do a lot of wine tasting, and that's what's the beautiful thing about wine, is that it evolves after you uncork the bottle of wine. Well, in the same way, if you add water to your bourbon, you're going to allow for an evolution to happen in your glass, and you get to experience it at different times and experiences. So whether you like our Jimmy's 90 proof, or you want to try our new cask strength Jimmy's bourbon, this will be available at our restaurant at Kiepersol. You can go to the bar, you can order a cocktail with the cask strength, or up at the Grand Room at Kiepersol, and you can purchase bottles to go. And it's going to be exclusively available here at Kiepersol. And of course, you can find Jimmy's Bourbon, our 90, on the store shelves throughout the state of Texas, as well as you can pick that up right here in Kiepersol. With that said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to send us a message or come in, and one of our bartenders or servers would be more than happy to answer some of your questions and help you get the best experience out of Jimmy's Bourbon.